We need to talk about your future, Emma. This vintage clothing thing isn't sustainable. I sat across from my parents and two brothers in their lawyer's office, listening to them plan an intervention for my failing business. My phone buzzed with an email I'd been waiting for. Sotheby's final authentication. The Balenciaga collection I'd assembled over 8 years was worth $3.8 million. I smiled and said, "Actually, let's talk about all of our futures. My name is Emma Catherine Mitchell, and I'm 34 years old. For the past decade, I've been building something extraordinary while my family watched with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. They saw thrift stores and estate sales. I saw investment opportunities in wearable art that most people threw away or donated without a second thought. Today, in this mahogany-paneled office in Boston's financial district, that distinction was about to become painfully clear. My mother, Patricia Mitchell, sat to my father's right, her Chanel suit impeccable, her disappointment in me equally pristine. My father, Robert Mitchell, was a retired investment banker who'd spent 40 years managing other people's money with conservative strategies and predictable returns. My older brother Jason, 38, worked in commercial real estate, and my younger brother Michael, 31, had just made junior partner at a corporate law firm. They were the success stories. I was the family concern. "Emma, we love you," my mother began, her voice carrying that particular tone of patience she reserved for difficult conversations. "But you're 34 years old. You can't keep living like you're in your 20s, going to garage sales and calling it a career." Jason leaned forward, his expression a mix of concern and condescension I'd seen countless times before. "Look, sis, we've done the math. You're barely covering your rent with this vintage stuff. Mom and Dad are worried, we're all worried. It's time to think about a real job. Maybe something in retail management where your fashion interest could actually generate stable income." I let the words wash over me, just as I'd done for years. The assumption that I was struggling. The belief that my passion was a phase. The certainty that they knew better than I did about my own life. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down to see the full email from Rebecca Chen, Senior Specialist at Sotheby's Fashion and Accessories Department. "Ms. Mitchell, authentication complete. Your Balenciaga collection, 1951 to 1968, verified and appraised at $3,847,000. We'd be honored to feature this in our spring auction. The Lesage embroidered evening coat alone is museum quality. Call me to discuss terms." I looked up to find everyone staring at me, clearly annoyed that I'd checked my phone during their carefully planned intervention. "Sorry," I said, setting the phone face down on the conference table. "Please continue. You were saying something about retail management?" Michael exchanged glances with Jason, then turned to our parents. "See, this is exactly what we're talking about. No focus, always distracted. Emma, do you even understand how serious this conversation is?" The lawyer, Thomas Harrison, an elderly man who'd handled our family's affairs for decades, cleared his throat softly. He'd been silent until now, but something in his expression made me sit up straighter. There was a gleam in his eyes, almost like anticipation. "Actually," Mr. Harrison said carefully, "before we continue with this discussion about Emma's future, there's a matter regarding your grandmother's estate that needs to be addressed. That's why I called this meeting." The room fell silent. Our grandmother, Catherine Montgomery Mitchell, had passed away 6 months ago at the age of 91. She'd been a formidable woman, a fashion editor at Vogue in the 1950s and 60s, with connections throughout the industry and an eye for quality that was legendary in her time. I'd been the only grandchild who'd spent significant time with her in her final years, listening to her stories about Balenciaga fittings and Givenchy's atelier. "Grandmother's estate?" Patricia asked, her voice suddenly interested. "I thought everything was straightforward. The house, the investments, divided equally among the grandchildren." "That was the assumption," Mr. Harrison said, pulling out a thick folder. "However, your mother left very specific instructions about certain assets that weren't included in the preliminary inventory." I felt my heartbeat quicken. Grandmother Catherine had mentioned something during one of our last conversations, something about making sure the one who understands goes to the right person. At the time, I thought she was confused, her mind wandering in those final days. "What assets?" Robert demanded, his banker's instincts immediately alert. Mr. Harrison opened the folder and pulled out several documents. Catherine Montgomery Mitchell maintained a storage facility in Manhattan for the past 40 years. The contents were never disclosed to the family because she wanted them to go to a specific heir, someone who would understand their value and continue the legacy. He looked directly at me, and I suddenly understood. The storage unit contains Catherine's personal collection from her years at Vogue. Samples from designers, gifts from fashion houses, pieces she purchased directly from ateliers in Paris. Over 300 items, all carefully preserved, all documented with provenance. My mother's face had gone pale. 300 vintage pieces? Those could be worth, conservatively, between $2.80 and $4.5 million, Mr. Harrison said calmly. I had them appraised last month by specialists from Christie's. The collection includes pieces from Dior's New Look era, early Yves Saint Laurent, Balenciaga's sculptural period, and a particularly rare group of Madame Grès gowns. Jason stood up so abruptly his chair rolled backward. That's impossible. Why wouldn't grandmother tell us about this? Why keep it secret? Because, Mr. Harrison said, pulling out another document, she wanted to see which grandchild would develop a genuine appreciation for fashion history and craftsmanship. She watched all of you carefully over the years, and she made her decision. He slid the document across the table to me. It was a letter, written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. My dearest Emma, I read aloud, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. You are the only one who understood that these clothes are not just fabric and thread. You saw them as I did, as art, as history, as the dreams and skills of people who dedicated their lives to creating beauty. While your brothers saw thrift stores, you saw treasure. While your mother saw embarrassment, you saw legacy. I paused, looking up at my family. My mother's eyes were wide with shock. My father's face had turned an interesting shade of red, and my brothers looked like they'd been struck by lightning. I leave you my entire collection, I continued reading, along with all documentation, letters from designers, and the connections I've maintained in the auction world. Build something beautiful with this, darling. Show them that what they dismissed as a hobby was actually the foundation of something extraordinary. And remember, the most valuable things are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with eyes to see them. The silence that followed was absolute. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, then turned to Mr. Harrison. When can I access the storage unit? Immediately, he replied, with what looked suspiciously like a smile. Your grandmother paid the fees through the end of this year, giving you time to properly catalog and decide how to proceed with the collection. This is insane, Michael said, finding his voice. Emma can't handle something like this. She doesn't have the business knowledge, the connections, Actually, I interrupted quietly, I do. I picked up my phone and opened my email, then turned it so they could all see the message from Sotheby's. I watched their faces as they read, watching the disbelief turn to shock turn to something that looked almost like fear. The Balenciaga collection Rebecca Chen mentions, I said calmly, that's mine. I've been building it for 8 years, sourcing pieces from estate sales, private collections, and yes, occasionally thrift stores. I've authenticated every item, documented the provenance, and built relationships with specialists at every major auction house in New York and London. I pulled up another email, this one from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is from the Costume Institute. They've asked me to curate a small exhibition next fall on American fashion collecting. They found me through my Instagram account, which has 340,000 followers, by the way. Most of them are serious collectors, museum professionals, and fashion historians. Jason sat back down slowly. 340,000 followers? The vintage clothing thing, I said, letting a bit of steel creep into my voice for the first time, isn't a hobby. It's not a failing business. It's not something I do because I can't get a real job. It's my career, and I'm very good at it. I opened my laptop, which I'd brought expecting to need to defend myself, though not quite like this. I pulled up a spreadsheet that I'd been maintaining for years. This is my inventory system, I explained, turning the screen so they could see. Every piece I own is photographed, authenticated, and tracked. I know what I paid, what it's worth now, and what it's likely to appreciate to. My current collection, not including grandmother's pieces, is valued at approximately $1.2 million. Last year, I sold pieces totaling $340,000, with a profit margin of 78%. My father, the investment banker, leaned forward despite himself. That's actually an impressive return. I've been doing this for 10 years, I continued. I started with $500 I saved from my college graduation money. I bought a 1950s cocktail dress at an estate sale, researched it until I could authenticate the designer, and sold it for $1,800. I took that money and bought 3 more pieces. Then 5, then 10. I pulled up my business banking records, which I'd never shared with anyone in my family. This is my business account. Current balance is $847,000. I own my apartment in Cambridge outright, paid for with profits from a particularly good year when I sold a collection of 1920s beaded evening gowns. I have no debt, a retirement account with $380,000, and investment properties in 2 states that generate rental income. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system humming. But how? Patricia whispered. You live in that small apartment, you drive that old car, you never. Never what? I asked. Never showed off? Never needed to prove anything to you? Never cared about impressing your country club friends with expensive displays of wealth? I stood up, gathering my laptop and phone. I learned from grandmother that the most valuable things are often the ones other people overlook. While you were all chasing traditional markers of success, impressive job titles and big houses in the right neighborhoods, I was building something real. Something I love, something that matters. Emma, wait, Robert said, and for the first time in my adult life, he sounded uncertain. I don't understand. If you were doing so well, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were struggling? I looked at my father, this man who'd spent my entire childhood emphasizing practical careers and safe choices. Because you never asked. You assumed. You saw thrift stores and decided I was failing. You saw my passion for vintage clothing and decided it wasn't serious. You created a narrative about my life and never once asked if it was true. I turned to Mr. Harrison. Thank you for handling this so professionally. I'll call you tomorrow to arrange access to the storage unit. Emma, please, my mother said, standing up. This is a lot to process. Can we talk about this? Can we what? I asked. Can we pretend that you didn't just stage an intervention to convince me to give up the career I've been successfully building for a decade? Can we forget that you were so certain I was failing that you called a family meeting with a lawyer to discuss my future? Jason cleared his throat. Look, we made a mistake. We should have asked more questions. But you have to understand, from our perspective. From your perspective, I interrupted, I was an embarrassment. The daughter who never quite lived up to the family standards. The sister who didn't have a real job. The granddaughter who wasted her time at estate sales instead of networking at the right clubs. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Grandmother understood something you never did. She understood that value isn't always obvious. That sometimes the most important work is the work that doesn't come with impressive business cards or corner offices. She spent 40 years in fashion, watching people dismiss craftsmanship and artistry because it didn't fit their definition of success. I smiled then, thinking of all those afternoons I'd spent with grandmother Catherine, listening to her stories about Cristobal Balenciaga's obsession with sleeve construction, or Madame Gressa's architectural approach to draping. She'd been preparing me, I realized, not just to inherit her collection, but to understand why it mattered. I'm going to continue doing exactly what I've been doing, I said. I'm going to build on grandmother's legacy, continue authenticating and collecting pieces that deserve to be preserved, and yes, I'm going to keep shopping at estate sales and thrift stores, because that's where treasures are found. As I left the office, I heard Michael say, "We really screwed this up, didn't we?" For once, my brothers were absolutely right. The weeks following that meeting were a whirlwind of activity and a complete reversal of family dynamics. I arranged access to Grandmother Catherine's storage unit, a climate-controlled facility in Manhattan's garment district. Walking through those racks of carefully preserved garments felt like stepping into a time machine. Each piece was wrapped in acid-free tissue, labeled with Catherine's meticulous notes about where and when she'd acquired it. There was a dove gray Balenciaga coat from 1953, its sleeve construction so perfect it looked like sculpture. A black Givenchy cocktail dress that Audrey Hepburn had worn to a premiere in 1962, gifted to Catherine after the event. 3 Madame Grès gowns in various shades of ivory, draped with such precision they seemed to defy gravity. And dozens more pieces, each with its own story, its own place in fashion history. Rebecca Chen from Sotheby's met me at the storage unit for the authentication process. She was a petite woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of mid-century fashion. "Emma," she said, running her hands carefully over a Christian Dior New Look suit, "this collection is extraordinary. Your grandmother had access to pieces that most museums would kill for. This Dior, for instance, has Carmel Snow's name sewn into the label. She was the editor of Harper's Bazaar. This was likely a gift directly from Dior's atelier. We spent 3 days cataloging every item. Rebecca brought in additional specialists for certain pieces. A textile expert from the Fashion Institute of Technology examined the Lesage embroidery work on several evening coats. A vintage jewelry appraiser evaluated the buttons and closures, many of which were valuable in their own right. Your initial appraisal was conservative, Rebecca finally told me. With proper documentation and the provenance your grandmother maintained, we're looking at $4.20 to $5.6 million, depending on market conditions. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left Mr. Harrison's office. Text messages from my mother, calls from Jason, emails from Michael. I'd ignored most of them, focusing instead on the work that needed to be done. But finally, my mother showed up at my apartment in Cambridge unannounced. "Emma, please," she said when I opened the door. "We need to talk about what happened." I considered closing the door, but something in her face stopped me. She looked older somehow, tired in a way I'd never seen before. "Come in," I said quietly. We sat in my living room, which was decorated with framed fashion illustrations and vintage photographs. Patricia looked around as if seeing the space for the first time, though she'd been here dozens of times before. "I never really looked at your apartment before," she admitted. "I mean, I saw it, but I never actually looked." "These illustrations, are they original?" "Most of them," I said. "That one is a René Grau from 1947. That's an Antonio sketch from the 1970s. I've been collecting them for years." She nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology, Emma. A significant one." I waited, letting her find her words. "Your father and I, we had such clear ideas about what success looked like. Good schools, professional careers, the right neighborhoods. It never occurred to us that there were other paths, other definitions. When you started this vintage clothing business, we saw it as a rejection of everything we valued." "It wasn't a rejection," I said. "It was a choice. A different choice than you would have made, but mine." "I know that now," Patricia said. "But at the time, all I could think about was what our friends would say, how I would explain that my daughter was shopping at thrift stores instead of working at a law firm or a bank." She paused, looking down at her hands. "Your grandmother tried to tell me, you know. About 6 months before she died, she said that you were the one who really understood value." I thought she was confused, getting old. I didn't realize she meant it literally. "Grandmother saw things clearly until the very end," I said. "She knew exactly what she was doing with that collection." "Can I see it?" Patricia asked suddenly. "The Sotheby's email, the collection details, all of it? I want to understand what you've built." I spent the next 2 hours showing my mother the reality of my business. The inventory systems, the authentication processes, the relationships with auction houses and museums, the financial records that proved this wasn't a hobby but a serious enterprise. She asked intelligent questions, her business degree from Wellesley finally focusing on her daughter's actual work instead of her assumptions about it. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "Emma, I had no idea. I feel like I've been blind for 10 years. You saw what you expected to see," I said. "Everyone did. Your brothers want to apologize too," she said. "Jason especially. He's been doing research on vintage fashion collecting, trying to understand what he missed." I smiled despite myself. "Let me guess, he's found articles about how it's actually a growing investment sector." "Several articles," Patricia confirmed. "And he's horrified at some of the things he said to you." "We all are. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Jason and Michael standing there with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery in Harvard Square. "Peace offering," Jason said, holding up the bag. "Can we come in?" What followed was the most honest conversation I'd ever had with my brothers. They admitted to dismissing my work, to making jokes about my thrift store hobby at family gatherings, to never asking real questions about what I actually did. "I told people you were between careers," Michael admitted, looking ashamed. "At networking events, when people asked about my family, I was embarrassed to say you collected vintage clothes. And now?" I asked. "Now I tell them my sister is a fashion historian and vintage clothing investor who's about to have a collection featured at Sotheby's," he said. "And I feel like an idiot for not seeing it sooner." Jason pulled out his laptop. "I have a proposition for you, and I want you to hear me out before you say no." He opened a presentation that he'd clearly spent significant time preparing. "I work in commercial real estate, as you know. What you might not know is that I specialize in retail properties. I have contacts with landlords throughout New England and New York." He clicked through several slides showing available properties. "These are potential locations for a brick-and-mortar presence. Not a store exactly, more like a gallery showroom where serious collectors and museums could view pieces by appointment. Climate-controlled, security systems, the works." I looked at the properties, my mind already calculating possibilities. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want to help," Jason said simply. "Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because this is actually a good business opportunity. You've built something valuable, and I have skills that could help it grow. No ownership stake, no family strings attached. Just me, using what I know to support what you've created." Michael cleared his throat. "And I'd like to help with the legal side. Formation of a proper corporate structure, contracts with auction houses, intellectual property protection for your Instagram brand. Again, no strings. Just making up for lost time." I looked at my brothers, these men who'd dismissed my work for a decade, now genuinely trying to understand and support it. Part of me wanted to refuse, to prove I didn't need their help. But another part, the part that grandmother Catherine had nurtured, understood that accepting help wasn't weakness. "Let me think about it," I said. "But I appreciate the offers." The Sotheby's auction took place 3 months later in their New York galleries. The Balenciaga collection I'd assembled over 8 years was featured in their important fashion auction, with pieces from grandmother Catherine's collection scheduled for a special sale the following season. I stood in the auction room wearing a 1960s Givenchy suit from grandmother's collection, perfectly tailored and remarkably preserved. My family sat in the row behind me. My mother had insisted on coming, and to my surprise, my brothers had cleared their schedules as well. The bidding for the Lesage embroidered evening coat started at $40,000. Within minutes, it had climbed to $125,000, with 3 phone bidders competing aggressively. When the hammer finally came down at $187,000, my mother gasped audibly. "Emma," she whispered, "that's incredible." "That's one piece," I whispered back. "We have 16 more in this sale." By the time the auction concluded, my collection had brought in $1.4 million, significantly above the pre-sale estimate. Rebecca Chen found me afterward, beaming. "Emma, that was extraordinary. We have 3 museums asking about first refusal for the Dior pieces from your grandmother's collection. And I've had calls from 6 private collectors who want to know what else you might have available." She handed me a business card. "This is Dr. Andrew Bolton from the Met's Costume Institute. He'd like to discuss a potential exhibition focused on American fashion collecting in the mid-century period. He wants to feature your grandmother's story alongside the pieces." I looked at the card, thinking about grandmother Catherine and all those afternoons we'd spent together. She'd known, somehow, that this was where it would lead. Not just to financial success, but to recognition of the artistry and history that these clothes represented. My father approached cautiously. "Emma, can we take you to dinner? To celebrate?" "Actually," I said, "I have plans. Rebecca has arranged a private viewing at the Fashion Institute of Technology for some serious collectors. But we could do brunch tomorrow?" "We'd like that," Robert said. And then, with obvious effort, he added, "I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. What you've built here, it's remarkable. The words I'd waited my whole life to hear, and now that they'd finally come, I realized I didn't need them anymore. I'd built something for myself, not for their approval. But still, they felt good to hear. 6 months after the Sotheby's auction, I stood in the gallery space that Jason had helped me find, a beautiful street-level property in Boston's Back Bay. The space was designed by a museum-quality conservation specialist, with climate control, UV-protected lighting, and security systems that would make Fort Knox jealous. Mitchell Heritage Fashion was printed in elegant letters on the frosted glass door. Inside, carefully selected pieces from both my collection and Grandmother Catherine's were displayed like the art they were. The Madame Grès gowns occupied one wall, lit to show the incredible draping technique. The Balenciaga coats were displayed on custom forms that highlighted their sculptural construction. I'd hired 2 assistants, both recent graduates from fashion history programs, who understood that these weren't just old clothes but pieces of cultural heritage. We operated by appointment only, serving serious collectors, museums, and occasionally, celebrities whose stylists knew about my reputation for finding extraordinary pieces. The business model was simple but effective. Some pieces I sold to collectors, others I loaned to museums for exhibitions, and a select few I kept for a permanent archive that I was building. The combination generated steady income while building long-term value and reputation. My Instagram account had grown to over 800,000 followers. I posted detailed histories of pieces, photographs of construction techniques, and stories about the designers who'd created them. The Metropolitan Museum of Art exhibition was scheduled to open in 3 months, featuring 20 pieces from Grandmother Catherine's collection alongside historical context about American fashion collecting. I was hosting a private viewing for a curator from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London when my phone rang. It was my mother. "Emma, I'm so sorry to bother you during work, but I'm at the country club and Margaret Westfield just asked me about vintage Chanel. Her daughter is getting married and wants to wear something special. I told her you might be able to help, but I wasn't sure if that's something you do." I smiled, thinking about all those years when my mother had been embarrassed to mention my work to her friends. "Yes, Mom, that's exactly the kind of thing I do. Give her my number and have her call the gallery. We have several Chanel pieces that would be perfect for a wedding." "Thank you, darling. And Emma, I'm having lunch with some friends next week, and they're all fascinated by what you do. Would you consider coming to speak to our group? About fashion collecting and investment?" "I'd be happy to," I said. "Let me know the date." After I hung up, the curator from the V&A, a sophisticated woman named Dr. Helen Chesterfield, smiled at me. "Your family is starting to understand what you've built here." Finally, I agreed. It only took a $3.8 million authentication and an auction at Sotheby's. "The best revenge," Dr. Chesterfield said, "is massive success. And my dear, you've achieved exactly that." She wasn't wrong. But as I looked around the gallery, at the beautiful pieces that represented decades of craftsmanship and artistry, I realized that revenge had never really been the point. Understanding was. Recognition was. Building something meaningful was. My family had dismissed my work as a hobby, a phase, an embarrassment. They'd staged an intervention to save me from my own choices. But in doing so, they'd given me the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth. That I'd been succeeding all along, just not in ways they recognized. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with eyes to see them. Grandmother Catherine had taught me that. And now, finally, my family was beginning to understand it too. The phone rang again. This time it was Jason. "Hey, sis. I have a client who's liquidating an estate in Newport. The deceased was a fashion editor in the 1950s. They mentioned vintage clothing in the inventory. Want me to get you the details?" "Absolutely," I said, feeling that familiar thrill of possibility. "Send me everything you have. Because that's what this business was really about. Not proving people wrong, not seeking revenge for years of dismissal. It was about the hunt, the discovery, the moment when you found something beautiful that everyone else had overlooked. Just like Grandmother Catherine had found in me, all those years ago, when everyone else was looking at my brothers instead."